pull up. Okay.
Welcome to Multi Vicar with me, James, and you,
Wayne.
Hi. Welcome, everyone.
What we're going to talk about... Oh, I was just about asking you what we're going to talk about, and you were saying this week we're talking about... Sorry, everyone.
I was going to say this week, Wayne, what are we talking about?
I asked you first, James.
We're talking about inquiries.
Yeah. So, what got you thinking about inquiries?
Just yesterday, they've announced that there's going to be an inquiry into the grooming gangs that have gone on in the last sort of decade.
Yeah.
And I did a quick look on how many inquiries, public inquiries, that have gone on in the last 10 years, because there was a throwaway comment on the news article about the volume of inquiries increasing. I looked at them and thought, yeah, God, there's quite a lot. And I just thought this is a really interesting topic to be talking about, because it's something that's going to be in the ether of conversations, and we want to equip you today to engage in those conversations in a slightly more front-footed way than we do normally. So we're just bringing some thoughts and some ways of engaging that we think can help us in our kind of gentle kind of poking at the way that the world thinks, and causing people to think about why they might think differently, or why some of their thinking might be confused, shall we say.
Yeah. And inquiries, so I was talking to an American friend of mine who sort of jokingly mentioned about how the United Kingdom love an inquiry. And that
we do love an inquiry.
Compared to
apparently
other countries.
They cost about 130 million on average, 130 million pounds.
Yeah. So Series 2 of The Gold is on, and there's a whole point where it opens up where they're basically saying we're going to shut down the police who are investigating the Brinks-Mat murder because they've already spent X amount of million on the inquiry, you know, and so this is costing us a fortune, let's stop this.
Yeah.
And I admitted that I once borrowed a book from a library that I haven't returned, didn't I? So I when I was a teenager, I became obsessed with the story of the Titanic, and I found in my school library the report that the official British government report following the inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic, and I borrowed it from my school library, and I still have it 30-something years later. And every 10 years there's a reunion, and every 10 years I mean to bring it back, and I forget to. But that library's now gone, so
there's nowhere to return it.
No. And apparently it was. I did admit it 10 years ago, and the teacher said, the teacher who remembered said, I think that was ordered in for you. We haven't had many people. So inquiries are not new.
No.
Let's
so just in case you're not familiar with this kind of area, we've had the COVID inquiry, we've had the Grenfell Tower inquiry, we've had this is the danger of starting a list. What other? We've had the ICSA.
Hillsborough. There's been a number of inquiries into the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, which was 30-something years ago. The inquiries. So what happens? When does an inquiry happen?
When there is a matter of public interest, essentially, that emerges, or whether there's something that's gone wrong in the post office. That's a classic. Here's a business that was once part of the. It was a government organisation, wasn't it? And it's now private. How is it that they have covered up all of this stuff and exposed these postmasters? There's an inquiry that goes on into it, and so the cost is there in the legal kind of requirements in order to get something like that done. So that inquiries are becoming more high profile, more common, and we want to talk about why that's the case, but also we want to talk about how that jars with the worldview that is supposedly the norm for the world in which we live. So the difference might be between what we speak and how we act.
So you talked about being on the front foot. So I've just done, if you're watching on YouTube, I've just played a forward defensive shot.
Yeah, you played it in a left-handed fashion.
I did. That's because I'm holding. I'm holding the bat wrong. But I was basically going to say, so instead of like getting forward and playing a defensive shot, we're going to go down the wicket and we're going to hit the ball for six.
Yeah.
So actually, if you're talking, when we talk to our friends, a lot of people are like, is there an object? Is there such a thing as fixed morality? Is there such a thing as
what is truth?
What is truth?
Yeah.
Is there such
my truth?
This is my truth.
This
tell me
your
yours.
Truth. I can believe this. You can believe that. And yet,
the existence of inquiries, you can basically this is just pure logic. That an inquiry exists because something's gone wrong.
Yeah.
An inquiry exists to discover the truth of what has gone wrong, and then to bring justice to where there has been mistakes. So actually, you can therefore say that the fact that we as a culture love an inquiry we presume that there is a truth.
Yeah.
That actually there is a truth to be discovered.
Yeah.
And so we might say, oh, this is my truth, tell me yours. But actually, when we say we need an inquiry, and we do this in the office, we need to find out what's happened. We believe that actually that in the world that we exhibit, in the world that we inhabit, that was the word I was looking for, that truth can be discovered, which is what scientists think. We can find truth.
And there's also a morality to it as well.
Yeah.
So in the case of the grooming gangs, there's an issue that's arisen as to why has it been delayed, and one of the kind of the loopholes that has existed up until this point is that the police tend not to prosecute sex between people under the age of 16 because there's the perception of love being a mitigating circumstance, and so that can get into a grey area when it's between people who are over and under the age of 16, and they would point to the difference between that and somebody who is perhaps twice the age of somebody who they are having sex with, and so there's that kind of grey area has been part of the problem up until now.
Yeah.
And the issue here is that there is that stance is being fought by a view that there is a morality, that there is a right and a wrong. So it's not just the truth of what has happened, there is a framework for how we should be behaving, and there is behaviour that has slipped into, that has become abusive and collectively abusive that needs to be named.
So the culture that we inhabit is a relative one. So morality is relative, truth is relative, and so therefore we philosophically shy away from objective truth statements because we don't want to offend anybody else's truth. But yet, when something happens that deep in our heart we know is wrong, we want to find out the truth about that. Yeah. The other thing about it is worth saying, because actually I don't want to just kind of sweep away all of our culture, because that's actually a straw man argument. Yeah. The other thing where our culture is quite good is and I think very strong is our culture has a critique and a doubt of power. Yeah. And so, for example, if you and I were sitting here recording a podcast in 1970s Russia, firstly, we wouldn't be doing that. Yeah. And we said there was an inquiry, actually a Russian inquiry onto communism. Yeah. So I'm thinking about, like, if you've watched the Chernobyl TV series, like show trials were about revealing truth, but it was revealing the truth that the state had already decided was the truth. Yes. The outcome was already fixed. Yeah. And so actually, somewhere our culture is good, will be saying, well, what is the agenda behind those who have called for the inquiry, or what is the agenda behind those who are running the inquiry, and where will they be wanting to misuse power to put out what might be their truth? And it is worth naming that actually our culture, the West just doesn't like power being misused, but we still. But we still have a longing for to be ruled well.
Yes. So Wayne, talk to me about this longing and where this longing comes from.
Well, I'm laughing because I'm thinking about our friend Charles Taylor. Yes. But he's just quoting St. Augustine. Yeah. So Augustine would say, "Our hearts are restless till we find our
rest in thee,
in Him alone." Yeah. And Taylor talks about how we live in what he calls an immanent frame, that basically the world that we inhabit has this frame around it, which is the transcendent one, which is God, and that actually all human cultures have this longing for God and for truth, and therefore actually for moral clarity and for love that comes from Him. Yeah. And so actually when something goes wrong and something in the human heart goes, that's not right, we can come on to my interview in Oxford, actually.
Yes.
That is something wired deep in us, because we're made in the image of God that recognises it's not right.
Yeah. So a while ago, you interviewed somebody on BBC Radio Oxford, was it?
Yeah. So BBC Radio Oxford, we tried to get Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, to be interviewed at the same time as Alistair McGrath, famous Christian theologian, and Dawkins refused. He didn't like to talk to McGrath publicly because Alistair's very gentle, but very good at kind of like. Yeah. Alistair was a scientist and a theologian. Dawkins is a sort of part-time theologian and scientist. So Alistair would generally have the better of him. So what we did is we interviewed Alistair week one and asked him all the same questions that we then asked Richard Dawkins the next week, and we pushed Dawkins on why where the morality for why we should care about those who are suffering in famine in an overpopulated world comes from. Because we were talking about survival of the fittest, adaptation of the species, and we were saying, like, within our own species, if you push your views to their extreme, Richard, actually in an overpopulated world, if there's a few million people who aren't going to make it, that's better for the rest of us. And he pushed back on and you have to pay attention to the strength of the argument in terms of social cohesion and community and a moral framework that he said we had evolved into.
Yes.
But when you sort of push back and go, but if you push you teleologically, and he wouldn't have anything of it,
So
and then he kind of he looked exasperated at me, and then said, but it's just wrong. and you want to go, well, where's that come from? And it's this sense that it's back to that if we're made in God's image, there is this deep desire in all of us for beauty, for truth, for love, for justice, and that comes from being made in the image of God. And no matter what we might think, theologically, philosophically, it rises up, and especially when those that we love are hurt.
Yes. So for those of you unfamiliar with Dawkins, he is sort of viewed as the father of New Atheism, which is a movement that began in the 90s. He wrote a book called The Selfish Gene, which was probably one of his more famous books. The God Delusion would be another, where the Selfish Gene is essentially an extrapolation of Darwin's work, and it rewrites the creation narrative, I think, and sort of puts it as the survival of the fittest is what's written into the DNA of the world in which we exist, and so if you extrapolate that from the physical to the metaphysical, even though he might deny the existence of the metaphysical, but to ethics, then essentially the natural extrapolation is that there is the survival of the fittest comes out in the survival of the fittest, and it's dangerous, it's offensive to people to say that, because it kind of has echoes of the kind of the Nazi ideology ultimately behind it. The kind of the Übermensch, which was a kind of a Nazi ideology about the Aryan race, and so it's understandable why people would be offended by that accusation, but I would say there isn't an adequate explanation of where morality emerges from if we are just beings who are evolving.
Yeah, so lots of people have written about this, how the philosophical thinking behind a lot of atheist thinking led to the kind of thinking around the Übermensch, around ethnic difference, around eugenics in the 1930s.
Yes.
And there's a brilliant book by a guy called Mark Masgow, I think I've cited it before, about Dark Continent, about actually we pick on the Nazis, but the Swedes were also doing eugenics, and the British government knew about what was going on in the Jewish concentration camps and didn't choose to bomb them. And that actually there was the Dark Continent thesis is that actually deep in our hearts was, at the end of this philosophical train, was this belief that their ethnicity were better.
Yeah.
And what's happened is atheism has kind of rolled on post the Second World War, is that aspect of it they've all had to shy away from because it's so dark and so...
So I think what I would want to say at this point is that we can as Christians look at this and we can say there is a tension in the way that people speak between this idea of a world where truth is your own, it is relative, where we are just beings who are evolving. That's the in inverted commas creation narrative of the world. That's how we have come to be, although they don't believe in the notion of creation. And so truth is relative, and then all of a sudden there's this lurch towards there must be truth, it has to be established, and there is a morality, and particularly when someone I know has been hurt or somebody I know might be in danger, and there is an injustice being perpetrated that has the potential to affect the society in which I live. And so what we want to do now is we want to understand, well, what's going on underneath that, and we think that it will lead to probably two different responses in conversations that we might have.
Yeah, so this is James, this is you at your best. So you were trying to work out, are we are we in that kind of messed up place around truth because we are a culture that doesn't believe?
Yeah.
So are we in that place because we are a culture that is choosing not to obey?
Yeah.
So are we a disobedient culture or a disbelieving culture?
Yes.
Or are we a bit of both?
Yeah.
You're in charge of this bit.
So Jesus, when he speaks, refers to a wicked and adulterous generation.
Yeah.
And so he in that moment is not just referring to the way in which people relate to one another in terms of adultery as marital unfaithfulness, but probably in the light of Hosea and the notion that a people who are of a covenant have turned their backs upon God,
Yeah.
and are going and worshipping other gods. And so he doesn't just define disbelief as disbelief. He will speak to a particular its generation is perhaps mistranslated. Sometimes it's more like people or a people group. So there are particular groupings who are wicked and adulterous, and therefore he will not perform signs in front of them. So in the scriptures, we have a distinction between those who just do not believe, and are when Jesus engages with Pilate, Pilate just doesn't.
What is truth?
What is truth? Doesn't believe in him. Different worldview. Can't accept who
Yeah.
Jesus is when standing in front of him. However, there's a group of people who are wicked and adulterous. There are others who are, in the Old Testament, you can have them referred to as stiff-necked or flint foreheads. There are different ways in which people express their rejection of God. And part of what we want to do here is understand the root of that rejection, so that then when we engage with it in terms of our conversations, we know what it is we're engaging with, rather than just engaging. It's almost like bash the rat, and you're hitting the wrong thing every time.
Very simple illustration. If I have a child and their bedroom is an absolute mess, if they have, they might have wired within them a sense of, it's really lovely when my bedroom is tidy, but if they don't know that their bedroom is supposed to be kept tidy, and they don't know how to tidy their bedroom, I'm going to speak to them in a different way about let's tidy the bedroom and why it's a good thing. I'm not going to deny the wrong of the mess of the bedroom, but I'm going to talk to them in a different way about how you tidy the bedroom than if I have a child who actually knows that the bedroom is supposed to be kept tidy, has been taught how to keep a bedroom tidy, and has been helped in the past how to keep a bedroom tidy.
Yes.
So I might be facing the same, and this is where we're getting to with our culture. It might look the same, but what is the understanding behind what's going on? Because actually, even though the problem is the same, I'm going to come at it and address it in a different way. That's what you're saying.
Yes. So if you look at the second half of the 20th century in the West, there were various social innovations around ethics, such as sex, sexual orientation, sexual activity, and around.
Well, there's the role of women, which is it's a good one. But actually, if you think of the whole way through the 20th century, there is how do we understand equality between the sexes? So it's not just so it's a whole.
And then there's essentially substance, so alcohol and drugs. And so the second half of the century, the 20th century, sees a largely Christian West struggling to come to terms with the fact that it has perpetrated war on itself for the first part of the century. In the second half of the 20th century, essentially emptying churches with a bunch of people who are making moral choices that are leading them to choose the thing that they want more than the God of their society.
Okay, let's knock the disbelief one on the head quite quickly, because I think we talk about being in a post-Christian society.
Yeah.
We've talked about this on this podcast, and I think it is very clear. So my eldest is 20. It's very clear when you talk to his generation that these guys are pretty much almost pre-Christian.
Yes. Tell me what you mean by pre-Christian.
Pre-Christian is they don't know anything of the gospel or of Christian theology to have rejected.
Yes.
And I think.
So
I'm pausing as I say it because I'm going, is that true? But actually it is.
So they might have pieces of it. They might be able to say, they might be able to name one or two stories about Jesus, but they can't put any thread through what the Bible says.
How would I describe it? So put it this way, I'm going to use Star Wars again. So I watched Star Wars first in my 40s.
Yeah.
And I think I was living in a post-Star Wars world in which I think I had enough knowledge of Star Wars to think that I knew the story and to have decided to reject it.
Yeah.
My children, when they watched it, they didn't come to Star Wars completely cold.
Yes.
Because everybody knows about Star Wars, but they were in a pre-Star Wars culture in that they didn't know enough to... So like, as we watched it, they knew about Star Wars, they knew about Jedi, but they did not know that Obi-Wan Kenobi was going to die. I did. They didn't know that Darth Vader was Luke's father. I did. But we still didn't know the story.
Yes.
And I had rejected Star Wars on a basis of enough knowledge to decide this isn't for me. They hadn't yet encountered Star Wars to go... And we're not going to go into whether it's a great film series, but they hadn't yet encountered it to make up their opinion. Does it make sense?
Yes.
And so I think there is in the West, I would say from a kind of mid-20s and down, there is a kind of almost like a pre-Christian, I'm going to call it pre-Jesus culture, that actually when they hear about Jesus and when they hear about the gospel and when they hear about that, it's almost like light bulbs going on for them, because that deep inner moral sense that they might be rebelling against, they suddenly go, oh, okay, so back to the bedroom. It's like going, do you know, if you tidy your bedroom, you'll be able to walk through the bed without stepping on Lego. And they go, oh, that makes sense to me. And
whereas there are people our generation up who, if they've been to a school where there's a chapel, they might describe themselves as almost inoculated to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
So they've heard it so many times that they just don't believe it, that they're like, actually, it has no effect on them.
So with a pre-Christian person, if you're talking, let's bring it back and then we'll move on to disobedience, because that's what I want you to hone in on. But if I'm talking to a kind of what I call a pre-Jesus person and I'm talking to them about inquiries, I can go, so inquiries seem to say that we long for truth and we long for justice, and there is truth to be found. And then you can kind of go, what if that was a signpost somewhere else? And then you open up a conversation that way. Yeah. Now, let's get to... Oh. That's disbelief. That's quite quick. But you were struck by how much of our culture is not marked by a pre-Christian, pre-Jesus disbelief, but by a post-Christian, post-Jesus disobedience.
Yes, so people who have made those moral choices essentially to reject the Christian God that they've heard about. Sometimes they haven't even made a decision to be a Christian then to walk away. They're just aware of it, and rather than pursuing it, they've just gone, no, I'd rather have this than that. And so there's a conscious rejection of that. And my perception of those friends who've been on that journey is that then the rise of new atheism sort of sits above that. And it is an explanation as to why they have rejected, because they'd never really believed it anyway. But then underneath it, you've got this, even if you could dismantle the new atheism, which is beginning to happen more and more if you can go down multiple rabbit warrens on YouTube around this kind of debate around the existence of God versus new atheism. But there's still something sitting underneath it around what it means to have rejected God.
And this is the real issue. So you kind of often come across people in the disbelieving camp. Mr. Dawkins probably been the most famous person I've ever spoken to in that camp, but quite a lot of other people. Yeah. And they will present to you, and if you're listening to this and this is you, please hear me say this in love, but quite often they will present to you their concerns, their thinking, their disbelief, and they will present it as an intellectual exercise. Yeah. The Bible very clearly presents it as a heart issue.
Yeah.
What does what does the Bible mean by that, James?
Go on. Well, I was sort of landing on. I was thinking, let's go. Where are we going with this?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I
thought it was
checked out. The Bible. What was the question? The Bible teaches.
So quite often when we talk about like disbelief, people will go, "Oh, I'm struggling to believe this or to think this through intellectually, or and it just doesn't make sense to me." When actually, what the Bible presents is that our disbelief is primarily an issue of the heart and the will,
Yeah.
and not an issue of the intellect.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, obviously, I'll waffle on that if you don't want to, but you're much brighter than me, so go for it.
No. That's definitely not true. I think there is a. I perceive in the stories of our generations and up that there is a misunderstanding about the kindness of God and His mercy. That means that hearts become hardened because He seems to be a God who would choose to deny people of things that they want.
Or not give them things
give them things that are good for them.
Yeah.
And so there's a confusion that emerges in the human heart, and then almost like a backing oneself into a corner around the sin that you want to commit, that you don't want to give up in order to receive God. But then if you don't know what that kindness is, then of course the sin that you want seems more appealing than the kindness that God has for you.
So one of the so Tim Keller would say would have said that one of the idols of the Western mind is comfort. So we've talked about individualism, but it's comfort, and life is anything but comfortable, and quite often I'm speaking to myself. My doubts arise when pain enters into my life.
Yeah.
And interesting enough, more often in a kind of low level when it's just kind of it's not a crisis. Crises, I think it's when the low level of pain or discomfort or something I have to work hard at or something that doesn't quite work
I've got
out.
to do this. I was planning to have time off.
Bit of a drudgery.
Yeah.
That's the point where I begin to go, oh.
Yeah.
And actually, there was an article in both New York Times and The Economist this week about Generation X, which you and I are, which is the guys who are getting into middle age now, and we're at the bottom of the U bend. And the U bend is that you're happiest as an adult in your 20s and in your late life, in your early adulthood and your late adulthood, and in the middle, when work is busy, kids are stressful, and parents are old, you're not actually that happy.
Yeah.
And so that might happen, and then we begin to, if we live in a world where the idol is comfort, and our lives aren't easy, that then can help, that can affect our hearts, and then we can begin to doubt.
Yeah.
And then, as you said, there might be things that we long for that actually God says I'm better than, and we don't trust Him in that, and then it begins to just kind of pile up from there.
And so I think we can say amongst the people of of this older generation, so 25 and up. Let's just take down people in their 30s in that statement. They're going to be really offended by that. That we don't know whether specific individuals have encountered the kindness of God and have turned their backs on it or not. We don't know whether people have had it inadequately explained to them and they've chosen other idols than God Himself. But in those circumstances, it's really important that we bring the kindness of God into those moments so that people can hear, as there's a search for a morality and a truth, what they don't hear is the judgment and the strictness and the harshness that possibly put them off it in the first place. So we have to find a way to say, actually, inquiries are really important because there are individuals who have had systemic injustice perpetrated against them, and they deserve our kindness and in recognizing that they have been on the end of that.
Yeah.
And it is part of the good in our society that we believe comes from being made in God's image, that means that actually we would want we don't believe that a bruised reed should be crushed. We believe that those who are vulnerable, and many of those who've been on the end of the injustices of these inquiries have been amongst the more vulnerable. We believe that they should have kindness patterned to them. But we also believe in a world, we as Christians controversially believe that there is a mercy for those who have contributed to that injustice. So we believe that when truth comes out, in the context of the cross, that there is mercy for our sin. So this isn't just about the victim's being shown kindness. We believe ultimately in a place where there is an inquiry that will go on over each of our lives individually at judgment, where in Christ, because of what we have experienced, we know that we can bring out the stuff of our lives truthfully. We don't have to hide it, and we know that there is a judge on the other end who has already dealt with the consequences of it.
So if you're thinking about being on the front foot and asking questions, and we're not really, I mean, basically talking to your friends, and I think the thing behind the thing is it's not so much talking to your friends about public inquiries, but it's talking to your friends about truth and morality. I would suggest, I think the best way in is always questions. So back to the messy room and the child who knows and the child who doesn't know. How did your room get like this?
Yeah.
And then what is your desire for your room to be like? And if they say, "Oh, I like it like this," do you really? Because you stood in your leg. And then as you get in, if you find that you're dealing with somebody with disbelief, you'll ask different questions and you'll point signposts. But if you find somebody who's in the kind of more as in they've heard the truth and they're kind of, why don't you think that works?
Yeah.
And so the way in is like Jesus, who doesn't condemn, is we don't hold back the fact that. Paul says it in Romans, actually, there's enough knowledge for us all to know we're in rebellion. Yeah. But we don't want to go, you're in rebellion. You just go, just why?
Why?
What do you long for? Why do you long for that? How do you think it comes to pass?
Yeah.
And at some point, you will see in all of those conversations, there will be a point where you can signpost them to Jesus. It's going to be, and I think the disobedience one is that one that's got to possibly be a little bit more nuanced, because we don't like to be pointed out that we're disobedient. No. But deep down in our hearts, we know. So you almost need to. It's just that gentle ask questions. Yeah. Probe. Find out why people think what they think, and see what goes.
Thanks for listening.